My parents treated me like a nobody while idolizing my sister, so I revealed her lies and watched their blind faith shatter to pieces. Thanksgiving at my parents' house had always followed the same predictable script. A carefully rehearsed performance where my sister Maria took center stage, basking in the warmth of endless praise, while I was expected to smile, nod, and accept whatever patronizing remarks were thrown my way. The house smelled like roasted turkey and buttered rolls, the air thick with a kind of forced cheerfulness that only existed in families that spent more time pretending to be close than actually being close. I had spent years sitting at this table, listening to the same conversations, the same backhanded compliments, the same dismissive tone whenever the topic of my life came up. Maria, as usual, was the golden child, the daughter who could do no wrong, the woman my parents spoke about with the kind of reverence reserved for saints and war heroes. She sat at the head of the table, leaning back comfortably, one arm draped over the chair next to her, smirking in that effortless way that came so naturally to her, the way she always did when she knew the room belonged to her. And of course my parents gushed, their voices dripping with pride, their eyes shining with admiration. Maria just bought the most beautiful house, 4 bedrooms, a gorgeous kitchen, and oh, the backyard is just stunning. It's the kind of home where you can really see a future, a real investment, something that just makes sense, you know. I knew exactly what was coming before they even turned to me, their eyes filled with that same expectant look, that same gentle condescension, that same unspoken comparison they had been making my entire life. But Leo, sweetheart, my father said, tilting his head slightly, his lips curving into a sympathetic smile. When are you finally going to settle down? For a moment, the room was silent, the question hanging in the air, waiting for me to respond the way I always did, with a forced laugh, a vague answer, an attempt to smooth over the blatant favoritism as if it didn't sting, as if I hadn't spent years swallowing the bitter taste of being second best. But this time, I was done playing along. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the warmth settle in my chest, letting the moment stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable, just long enough to make my parents shift slightly in their seats, just long enough to see Maria's smirk deepen as if she was already preparing to hear me fumble through another excuse. Then I set my glass down carefully, looking directly at my parents, my voice calm, steady, and sharp enough to slice through the artificial warmth of the room. Oh, I said with a small knowing smile. I already did. I just didn't invite anyone who doubts me. The sound of my parents' forks clattering against their plates echoed through the sudden, deafening silence. The quiet gasp from my aunt, barely audible over the collective intake of breath around the table. My parents' lips parted slightly, their eyes widening, confusion flickering across their faces as they struggled to process my words, as if the very idea of me having a life they weren't aware of, a life they hadn't approved of, was impossible to comprehend. Maria, for the first time in her life, actually looked unsettled, her smirk faltering, her fingers tightening slightly around her glass, her eyes narrowing as if trying to decide whether this was some kind of joke. You what? My mother finally stammered, her voice thinner now, no longer carrying that effortless certainty she always had when speaking about Maria. What do you mean you settled down? You didn't tell us anything about... Exactly, I said smoothly, taking another sip of wine, watching as the realization started to creep in, as the whispers started spreading down the table, as the carefully crafted illusion of our family's perfect balance began to crack piece by piece. My parents' gazes darted toward Maria, as if looking for reassurance, as if expecting her to smirk and roll her eyes and dismiss my words as some kind of sarcastic remark. But Maria didn't say a word, her jaw tightening slightly, her fingers tapping idly against the table, her confidence shaken just enough for me to see it, just enough for me to enjoy it. Leo, my father said again, his voice more cautious now, his eyes searching mine for some kind of answer that would make sense to him, something that would put things back into the neat little boxes he had arranged in his mind. What exactly do you mean by that? I smiled, slow and deliberate, savoring the moment, savoring the way the power had shifted in the room, savoring the way they all leaned in slightly, waiting, expecting me to explain myself, to justify myself, to give them the details they suddenly seemed so desperate to know. But I didn't. Instead, I reached for the mashed potatoes, casually spooning some onto my plate, completely unfazed by the silence, by the eyes burning into me, by the fact that, for the first time in my life, I had taken the attention away from Maria without even trying. And as I took a bite, as I chewed slowly, as I let the moment stretch just a little longer, I saw it. The first crack in my parents' certainty, the first hint of doubt in Maria's eyes, the first time in years that the conversation wasn't revolving around her. I swallowed, wiped my mouth with my napkin, and then, finally, I met my parents' gaze with a look that said everything I didn't need to say out loud. "You always assumed I was behind," I said, my voice soft but firm, my words sinking into the heavy air between us like stones in water. "You just never bothered to ask where I was going." Silence. Thick, heavy, suffocating silence. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the afterthought sitting in the shadow of the sun they had always put on a pedestal. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had won. The silence in the dining room stretched longer than I expected, the weight of my words settling over the table like an unexpected storm cloud, lingering in the space where my parents' effortless confidence used to be. For years they had spoken about Maria with a certainty that bordered on worship, a belief so deeply ingrained that they never stopped to consider the possibility that I had been doing just fine on my own. I could see it in the way they blinked rapidly, their fingers clutching their napkins, their mouths slightly open as if trying to find a way to steer the conversation back to something they could control. Maria shifted in her seat, the flicker of unease behind her smirk barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime studying her. She had always been so sure of her place in this family, so secure in the knowledge that she was the successful one, the one who mattered, the one our parents would always put first. But now, for the first time, I had taken something from her. Attention, control, the power to dictate the narrative, and I could feel the frustration radiating off her like heat. "So, Leo," my Aunt Carol finally said, breaking the tension with a forced lightness that did nothing to mask the curiosity in her voice, "where exactly is this house of yours?" I took my time, chewing my food, setting my fork down carefully, letting my gaze sweep across the table, watching as the interest in my life, for once, outweighed the usual dismissiveness. It was almost amusing how little they knew about me, how little effort they had ever made to ask real questions about my choices, my plans, my success. They had spent so much time assuming I was floundering that it had never occurred to them that I might actually be ahead. "Oh, I said casually, reaching for my wine glass, swirling the deep red liquid slowly before taking a small sip, "not too far from here. About 20 minutes or so, depending on traffic." That answer was deliberately vague, just enough to keep them wondering, just enough to make them itch for more details, just enough to let the power continue shifting in my favor. My father cleared his throat, regaining just enough composure to attempt to mask his irritation, but I could see the way his grip on his fork had tightened, the way his shoulders had tensed slightly. "How long have you had it?" he asked, his tone even but laced with the kind of forced politeness he reserved for people he didn't particularly respect. I shrugged, leaning back slightly in my chair, enjoying the way the entire table was hanging on to my words now, waiting, expecting, desperate to fill in the gaps of a story they had never bothered to ask about before. "Almost a year," I said, pretending not to notice the way my parents' expressions twitched, the way Maria's smirk vanished for just a fraction of a second before she covered it up with another sip of her drink. A year, an entire year of owning my own home, of making my own decisions, of living a life separate from their expectations, and they had never known. It was almost laughable how easy it had been to keep it from them, how little effort it took to build something for myself, without ever feeling the need to seek their approval. "Why didn't you say anything?" my mother asked, and this time the strain in her voice was undeniable. The realization creeping in that she had been left out, that she had not been part of something important, that she had failed to see something she had always assumed she controlled. I tilted my head slightly, pretending to think about it, pretending that this wasn't the moment I had been waiting for, pretending that her question hadn't already been answered a long time ago. "I guess it just never came up," I said, keeping my voice light, letting the words linger, watching as she struggled to find a response that wouldn't make her look as out of touch as she clearly felt. Maria let out a short laugh, shaking her head, leaning back in her chair with the same forced confidence she always relied on when she felt threatened. "Come on, Leo," she said, smirking just enough to make it clear she was trying to regain some ground. "A house is a pretty big deal. Kind of weird to keep something like that a secret, don't you think?" I met her gaze steadily, letting her see that I wasn't intimidated, that I wasn't going to shrink under her scrutiny the way I had in the past, that whatever power she thought she had over me was slipping through her fingers faster than she realized. "Not really," I said, lifting my glass again, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable, just long enough for the weight of my words to settle. "I mean, it's not like anyone ever asked." The subtle jab landed exactly where I wanted it to. My parents' lips pressed into thin lines. My aunt shifted awkwardly in her seat. Maria's smirk faltered, just enough for me to see the frustration beneath it. They had never asked, never cared to check, never once considered that I might be building something for myself while they were too busy focusing on Maria's every move. "Well," Maria said after a long pause, regaining just enough composure to attempt another shot, her smirk returning, her voice dripping with that same smugness she had always used to remind me of her supposed superiority. "What kind of place did you even buy?" I smiled, slow and deliberate, setting my glass down carefully before looking her directly in the eye. "Oh," I said, my voice effortlessly calm, my words landing with the force of a final, undeniable truth. "It's bigger than yours." The stunned silence that followed was even more satisfying than I had imagined. Maria's smirk twitched at the corners, her confidence wavering just slightly, her fingers tightening around her glass as if she needed something to hold on to, something solid to anchor her in the suddenly shifting conversation. For the first time in years, she wasn't the center of attention, wasn't the unquestioned star of the evening, wasn't the one basking in our parents' relentless praise while I was left to sit quietly in the background. And judging by the tension in her jaw, she didn't like it. The silence that followed my last words hung over the table, thick and suffocating, stretching long enough for the weight of them to fully sink in. My parents blinked rapidly, their lips parting as if they wanted to say something, but for once, there was nothing they could offer to immediately dismiss or downplay what I had just said. "Bigger?" my Aunt Carol finally asked, her brows raising slightly, her curiosity now overtaking her usual indifference. "Well, how big are we talking here, Leo?" I could feel Maria's eyes burning into me, her smirk now nothing more than a strained line, her fingers tapping impatiently against the table, her irritation barely contained beneath her thinly veiled composure. She had spent her whole life being the one with the most impressive achievements, the most praiseworthy milestones, the one everyone in the family admired, but now that certainty had been shaken and she hated it. I leaned back slightly, letting my fingers graze the stem of my wine glass, taking my time before answering, enjoying the way the power had so effortlessly shifted in my favor. "Just over 4,000 square feet, I said lightly, my tone casual, almost uninterested, as if the number didn't carry any weight at all. Maria's expression barely flickered, but I caught it, the slight widening of her eyes, the way her grip on her glass tightened just a little more, the way her smirk struggled to stay in place. 4,000? My cousin Lisa repeated, her voice somewhere between impressed and disbelieving. That's huge, Leo. My parents inhaled sharply, blinking as if trying to process the information, trying to reconcile it with the version of me they had always carried in their minds. The version that needed guidance, that needed concern, that wasn't quite as accomplished or successful as Maria. "But sweetheart," my mother said, finally forcing a thin smile, her voice just a little too tight. "Don't you think that's a bit much for someone on their own?" And there it was. I could almost hear the desperate attempt to regain control in her voice, the subtle, almost instinctive effort to turn my success into something that required justification, something that needed to be explained, something that couldn't just be accepted at face value. I let the question sit for a moment, watching her, watching my father, watching Maria, watching the way their carefully crafted perceptions of me were crumbling piece by piece. "Not really," I said finally, my voice even, unwavering, perfectly calm. I mean, I didn't take out a mortgage or anything, so it's not like I have to worry about it being a financial strain. The reaction was instant. Maria's glass hit the table a little harder than necessary, her knuckles white against the glass, her entire body stiffening as if I had just slapped her across the face. My parents' mouths fell open slightly, their carefully maintained expressions cracking just enough for me to see the genuine shock beneath it. "You," my father started, his voice faltering for the first time all night. "You paid for it in full?" I tilted my head slightly, pretending to consider my answer. Even though I already knew the impact of what I had just revealed, even though I had imagined this exact reaction 1,000 times before. "Yeah," I said, my tone light, my smile unbothered, my posture completely relaxed. I mean, it just made sense. No debt, no loans, no worrying about interest rates. Just mine. The weight of my words settled heavily across the table, thick and undeniable, shifting the energy of the entire room in an instant. Maria's face had gone pale, her smirk long gone, her confidence visibly unraveling in real time. She had spent her entire life being the golden girl, the one with the most to brag about, the one our parents doted on endlessly, the one who had always been one step ahead. And yet, here I was, calmly revealing that I had surpassed her without even trying, without seeking validation, without needing anyone's approval. "So," I said, letting my gaze drift toward her, watching as she swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. "How's your mortgage, Maria?" Her jaw clenched, her eyes flashing with something dangerously close to resentment, her fingers gripping the edges of her plate like she was trying to keep herself from snapping. My parents cleared their throats, trying desperately to salvage the conversation, to redirect the attention back to Maria, to rebuild the image that had just shattered in front of everyone. "Well," my mother said quickly, her smile forced, her voice a little too bright, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap. "Maria's home is absolutely lovely, and it's in such a wonderful neighborhood, such a smart investment." Maria exhaled sharply, straightening in her chair, forcing a tight smile back onto her face, clearly relieved by the save. "Yeah," she said, her voice a little stiff, her confidence not quite as effortless as before. "And you know, real estate is all about timing. The market's been tricky, but I got a great deal." Aunt Carol raised an eyebrow, tilting her head slightly, clearly intrigued by the sudden shift in Maria's demeanor. "Wait," she said, setting her fork down. "You didn't pay for your house in full?" The question landed hard, the sudden change in conversation knocking Maria off balance once again. She hesitated, barely a fraction of a second, but it was long enough. "Well, no," she admitted, shifting in her seat, her fingers tightening around her napkin. "I mean, most people don't, right? That's not really how it works." I let out a soft hum, swirling my wine slowly, pretending to consider her words, even though I already knew the truth, even though I had already won. "That's fair," I said, my voice light, unbothered. "I guess some of us just prefer not to owe anyone anything." Maria didn't respond, her jaw tight, her expression unreadable, her hands still gripping the table as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. And for the first time in my life, I watched as the golden girl cracked. The tension in the dining room had shifted from awkward curiosity to something sharper, something more unsettled, something teetering on the edge of collapse. Maria still sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers wrapped too tightly around her napkin, her jaw locked in a way that told me she was trying to hold her composure, but the cracks were already starting to show. My parents, sitting beside her, were clearly desperate to regain control of the conversation, but every attempt they made to steer things back toward her supposed success had fallen flat. I had spent my entire life sitting at this table, listening to them brag about her as if her accomplishments somehow validated their existence, as if her every success was proof that they had raised the perfect daughter, the one who had done everything right, the one who had never disappointed them. And I had spent just as many years biting my tongue, letting the comparisons roll off my back, pretending that it didn't matter when they glossed over my achievements, when they treated me like an afterthought, when they made it clear that I would never measure up to the image they had built of her. But tonight, that image was starting to crumble, and I wasn't about to stop it. "You know," I said, tapping my fingers lightly against the table, keeping my voice even, keeping my expression carefully composed. It's funny how much people assume about you when they don't actually bother to ask. My father exhaled sharply, his shoulders stiffening, his lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. "Oh, come on, Leo," he said, forcing a strained chuckle, shaking his head as if he could dismiss everything I had just said, as if he could smooth over the undeniable fact that, for the first time in years, Maria wasn't the center of attention. "It's not like we ignore you." I let out a short, humorless laugh, cutting him off with nothing more than the slight tilt of my head, watching as he faltered, as he realized too late that his usual deflections wouldn't work this time. "Really?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, my voice dripping with something too sharp to be mistaken for anything other than truth. "When was the last time you asked me about my career? When was the last time you asked about my finances, my goals, my plans, my future?" The silence that followed was loud enough to drown out the soft clinking of silverware against plates, loud enough to press against the edges of the perfectly curated reality my parents had spent years maintaining. "You never asked," I continued, my voice softer now but no less firm, no less sure, no less filled with the quiet confidence I had spent years building without their approval. "Because you never thought you had to. You assumed Maria was the only one worth bragging about, the only one with a future, the only one who deserved the spotlight. So I stopped trying to impress you. I stopped waiting for your validation, and I made something for myself without ever needing you to notice." My parents opened their mouths, then closed them again, their fingers twitching slightly where they rested against the table, their expressions torn between defensiveness and something dangerously close to realization. Maria let out a sharp breath, her smirk returning, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Okay, Leo," she said, her voice too smooth, too forced, too controlled for someone who wasn't feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. "We get it. You bought a house, you did well for yourself. Congratulations. Do you want a medal?" I turned my gaze to her slowly, watching as she shifted, as she rolled her shoulders, as she tried desperately to regain the power she had always held over me. "No," I said, my voice calm, unbothered. "But maybe you should think about getting some financial advice before you keep running your mouth." Her smirk twitched. "Excuse me?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, tilting my head just enough to let her know that I wasn't playing, that I wasn't just throwing words around to get a reaction, that I had something she didn't want me to say out loud. "You like to talk about your success," I said, watching the flicker of discomfort in her eyes, watching as her fingers curled just slightly against the table. "You like to act like you're the one who has it all figured out. But the truth is, Maria, you didn't really buy your house, did you?" The blood drained from her face so fast that for a moment I thought she might actually be sick. The entire table had gone still, every set of eyes darting between me and Maria. My parents sat up straighter, their hands clutching the napkins in their laps as if holding on to them would somehow stabilize the conversation. "Leo," my mother said slowly, carefully, like she was afraid of what I might say next, like she already knew she wouldn't like it. "What are you talking about?" I didn't look away from Maria. "Did you tell them, Maria?" I asked, keeping my voice light, tilting my head slightly. "Did you tell them that you're drowning in debt? Did you tell them that you didn't actually buy that house, that the bank owns most of it, that you maxed out multiple credit cards just to cover the down payment, that you're barely keeping up with your mortgage payments?" My parents gasped, their faces going pale, their eyes darting to Maria, searching for reassurance, searching for the version of her they had always believed in. "That's not," Maria started, her voice strangled, her hands clenching into fists against the table. "Not what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, giving her one last chance to admit the truth before I said it for her. "Not true? Because I pulled your credit report, Maria. I know exactly how much debt you're carrying. I know exactly how much you owe, how much you're struggling, how much you've been lying to everyone sitting at this table." The silence was deafening. Maria's face twisted with something ugly, something furious, something that she had never directed at me before, something that told me I had hit the one nerve she had never expected me to find. "You little—" she started, pushing back her chair abruptly. But my father's sharp intake of breath stopped her. He turned to her slowly, his hands shaking, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disappointment, the kind he had never once directed at her in all the years he had spent believing she could do no wrong. "Maria," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but heavy with something final, something undeniable. "Tell me that's not true." And for the first time in her life, Maria had no answer. The silence in the dining room stretched long and thick, hanging over the table like a fog that refused to lift, settling deep into every tense muscle, every clenched fist, every weary glance exchanged between the people who had just been forced to face a truth they never saw coming. My parents sat rigid in their chairs, their fingers curled so tightly around the napkins in their laps that the fabric had twisted into crumpled messes, their breaths uneven, their lips slightly parted as if they wanted to speak but couldn't quite find the words. Maria, on the other hand, looked like a woman who had just been backed into a corner. Her jaw was set so tight I thought her teeth might crack under the pressure, her chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths as she struggled to come up with something, anything, that would make this moment go away. I had spent years watching her manipulate conversations, twist words, redirect attention back onto herself whenever things didn't go her way. And I could tell, even now, that her mind was racing, desperately trying to piece together some excuse that would put her back in control. But the thing about control is that once you lose it, once it slips through your fingers in front of the people who have always believed in you without question, it's nearly impossible to get it back. "You're lying," Maria finally said, her voice flat, steady, but carrying the sharp edge of someone who is just a little too desperate to be convincing. "You don't know what you're talking about." I let out a slow breath, tilting my head slightly, watching her, studying the way her fingers twitched against the table, the way her eyes darted briefly toward our parents before settling back on me. She was waiting for them to step in, waiting for them to defend her, waiting for them to do what they had always done, dismiss anything that made her look bad and shift the blame onto someone else. But for once they didn't. Instead, they turned toward her, their brows furrowed, their voices quiet but laced with something I had never heard directed at her before: uncertainty. "Maria," my mother said, her tone cautious, careful, as if she was afraid of the answer. "Tell me Leo is wrong." Maria let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head quickly, forcing a smirk that barely lasted a second before cracking under the weight of the moment. "Mom, Dad, come on," she said, waving a hand dismissively, her voice taking on that same patronizing tone she had always used when trying to make herself sound like the rational one. "Leo's just trying to stir up drama." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, my expression calm, steady, unbothered. "If I'm lying," I said, keeping my voice light, tilting my head just enough to make her squirm, "then why don't you show Mom and Dad your bank statements, your mortgage details? Go ahead, Maria, prove me wrong." Her jaw tightened, her breath hitching for just a fraction of a second, her fingers clenching into fists so tight that her knuckles turned white. And that was all the proof anyone needed. My parents inhaled sharply, their eyes widening, their hands flying to their mouths as if they could physically stop themselves from gasping out loud. "Oh my God," my mother whispered, her voice barely above a breath, the weight of realization crashing over her like a tidal wave. Maria's entire body stiffened, her fists pressing into the table, her breath coming out in quick, uneven bursts as the truth settled over the room. Undeniable, inescapable, suffocating. "How much?" my father asked, his voice shaking, his fingers trembling as he turned to face her fully now, no longer looking to me for answers, no longer trying to pretend this was anything other than exactly what it was. "How much do you owe?" The room fell into an eerie stillness, the weight of his question pressing down on all of us, the tension thick enough to choke on. Maria hesitated, her tongue darting out to wet her lips, her fingers flexing against the table, her entire body screaming reluctance. Then finally, through gritted teeth, she muttered, "A little over 300,000. The collective inhale around the table was almost deafening. My parents actually reeled back, their hands gripping the edge of the table as if the number had physically knocked the breath from their lungs. 300? My mother started, but the words got stuck, tangled in her disbelief, her devastation, her humiliation. Maria ran a hand through her hair, her breath uneven, her knee bouncing under the table in barely contained frustration. "It's not as bad as it sounds," she said quickly, her voice laced with thinly veiled desperation, her hands gesturing wildly as if trying to physically swat away the weight of her own failure. I have a plan. I'm restructuring my finances. It's just temporary. Temporary? My father's voice was sharp now, slicing through her excuses like a blade, his face flushed with something dangerously close to disgust. You told us you bought that house outright. You let us tell everyone how successful you were, how well you were doing, and all this time you were drowning in debt. Maria opened her mouth, then closed it again, her throat working, her hand shaking slightly as she realized there was no way out of this. No story she could spin, no version of events that could make this disappear. And I just sat there sipping my wine, watching it all unfold exactly the way I knew it would all those years, I murmured, my voice soft but cutting, my eyes locking onto hers, watching the flicker of resentment flash behind them. Mom and Dad treated you like you were untouchable, like you were better, smarter, more responsible than me. And all this time, you were barely keeping your head above water, while they ignored everything I built for myself. My parents turned toward me then, their mouths opening as if to protest, as if to argue, as if to salvage some version of the truth that would let them keep believing Maria was the daughter they had always thought she was. But there was nothing left to say. Maria's chair scraped against the floor as she suddenly stood, her fists clenched at her sides, her face twisted with anger, her breathing uneven, her entire body radiating rage. And then, just as I expected, she turned that rage toward me. You think you're better than me? She snapped, her voice sharp, shaking, her eyes burning with something dark, something venomous. You think you've won something here? I smiled, slow and deliberate, tilting my head slightly as I met her furious gaze with nothing but pure, unwavering satisfaction. I don't think I've won, I said simply, my voice calm, steady, unshaken. I know I have. Maria's breathing was uneven. Her fists clenched so tightly at her sides that her knuckles had turned ghostly white, her jaw locked in a way that made the muscle twitch beneath her skin. She wasn't just angry, she was furious. The kind of rage that boiled over when someone who had spent their entire life on top suddenly found themselves staring up from the bottom. The kind of anger that only came from watching an illusion you built with your own hands shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I could see it in her posture, in the way her shoulders rose and fell with each sharp inhale, in the way her fingers twitched like she wanted to grab something, smash something, lash out at someone, anyone. But the only person left to blame was herself. You just couldn't help yourself, could you? Maria finally snapped, her voice sharp, strained, dripping with bitterness as she glared at me across the table, her entire body radiating barely restrained fury. You couldn't let me have one night without turning it into some competition, without trying to make yourself look better at my expense. I let out a soft, amused breath, shaking my head slowly, watching as her face twisted even further in frustration, her words landing weakly against the sheer force of reality pressing down on her. I never tried to make myself look better, Maria, I said smoothly, my voice carrying the kind of calm that only comes when you know you've already won. You did that all on your own. The dining room was silent, save for the sound of my parents' uneasy shifting in their chairs, their breaths shallow, their hands still clutching the napkins in their laps, as if they were the only things tethering them to the ground. They were staring at Maria now, not with admiration, not with pride, not with the unwavering devotion they had always reserved just for her. No. This time their expressions were something else entirely. Something unfamiliar, something cold, something that Maria had never had to face before, disappointment. She must have seen it too, because her entire face twisted, her hands slamming against the table as she let out a sharp, humorless laugh, the sound brittle and hollow, filled with something dangerously close to desperation. Are you seriously going to sit there and look at me like that, Mom, Dad? She demanded, her voice cracking just slightly at the edges, her eyes wide, wild, searching for some last shred of the blind loyalty she had always counted on. After everything I've done, after everything I've accomplished, you were really going to act like he's the one you should be proud of? My parents inhaled sharply, their fingers tightening around the napkins, their lips pressing into thin lines as they looked at her, as they really looked at her for the first time in years, as they took in the full weight of everything she had been hiding, everything she had been pretending to be, everything she had failed to live up to. "We don't even know who you are," my mother whispered, her voice barely above a breath but carrying the kind of finality that made Maria flinch, like she had been physically struck. Maria took a step back, as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs, her face twisting, her entire body stiffening with something dangerously close to panic. "Oh, please," she spat, shaking her head, forcing a sharp, bitter laugh that only made her look more pathetic, more desperate. "Like he's so perfect, right? Like Leo's been waiting his whole life to rub this in my face, to make me look like the failure, to make you think I'm the failure." "You are the failure," I cut in smoothly, watching as she snapped her mouth shut, her face contorting with rage, her hands twitching at her sides. "Not because you struggled, not because you made bad financial decisions, not even because you lied about all of it. No, Maria, you're the failure because you spent your entire life thinking you were better than me. Thinking you didn't have to work as hard. Thinking that our parents' approval was all you ever needed to be untouchable." Maria's lips parted slightly, her breath uneven, her eyes burning with something close to fear. But I wasn't done, and guess what? I continued, tilting my head slightly, my voice soft but sharp, calm but devastating. "They're not proud of you anymore, and they never will be again." The words landed like a hammer, like a wrecking ball, like the final, irreversible crack in the image she had spent her entire life crafting. I could see it in the way her face paled, in the way her breath hitched, in the way her entire body seemed to deflate under the weight of it all. My parents hadn't spoken again, but they didn't have to. The way they looked at her said enough, and that was the moment she knew it was over. There was no coming back from this. The golden girl wasn't golden anymore. I pushed my chair back slowly, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade, standing up and smoothing my shirt as I glanced around the table, taking in the stunned expressions, the shocked silence, the way every single person in the room had realized, in real time, that the entire family narrative had just been rewritten right in front of them. Maria stood there, frozen, humiliated, seething but powerless to do anything about it. I reached for my jacket, slinging it over my shoulder, and took my time making my way toward the door, feeling lighter than I had in years, feeling the weight of their doubt, their dismissal, their constant belittling finally lift off my shoulders. I paused just before stepping out, glancing back at my parents, meeting their gazes one last time, watching as they struggled with the realization that they had never really known me at all. "Next time you ask about my life," I said lightly, my voice dripping with quiet satisfaction, "maybe try actually listening." And with that, I walked out the door, strong, free, and completely untouchable.